All right, so let's pick back up with the sliding filament mechanism of contraction. This is what happens in a skeletal muscle. Uh, the hands represent a single large sarcomere. The fingers are thick and thin filaments in the zone of overlap. The inner edges of the palms, here, here, are the Z discs. If you move the fingers together slowly, the sarcomere, the width of the two hands, grows progressively shorter, but the fingers do not change in length. In other words, they are sliding over each other, and that's the way those fibers, when in the previous video where I showed you the head reaches up and grabbed and slid things along, they just pull this way. The muscle's getting shorter, but the individual fibrils are not changing length. The sarcomere extends from one Z disc to the next, the functional unit of contraction. The sliding filament mechanism explains tension generation during muscle contraction. Both the I band and the H zone narrow. The A band is unchanged. The myosin heads attached to actin pull the thin filaments toward the M line, brings the Z discs closer together and shorten the sarcomere. Sarcomeres are arranged end to end with each myofibril. When simultaneously contracted, shorten the whole muscle fiber. And there you see, this is the A band. The A band, if you notice, the A band itself is still the same size, but look closely at this area right here, pictured by the dark red. How in this relaxed sarcomere, it's narrow, but in the contracted sarcomere, it's shorter. And you see these thin filaments have slid over the thick filaments, the sliding filament effect. Skeletal muscle fibers as electrically excitable cells. So this section is going to show us how the electrical impulses change. So membrane potentials, remember I mentioned membrane potential earlier, are due to unequal distribution of ions near the plasma membrane, resulting in a polarized resting state. Polarized meaning there is a charge there. The thin layer of negatively charged ions in the cytosol on the inside of the cell. There is a thin layer of positively charged ions on the outside of the cell, which we're going to show you an image in a moment. The separation of charges creates an electrical gradient. Remember our core principles from chapter 1. And that electrical gradient represents a source of potential energy. When the barrier separating the ions is removed, they follow their gradients, creating a flow of electrical charges. Potential energy becomes kinetic energy. The electrical gradient can therefore be referred to as an electrical potential. And again, here's my image. So the extracellular fluid with all of its positive charges, the cytosol or the intracellular fluid and all of its negative charges. There's the plasma membrane keeping them separated. And away from the sarcolemma, the positive and negative charges represent equal numbers. That means that the cytosol and the extracellular fluid are always electrically neutral. However, you stick a probe in there with a minus 90 millivolts, and you get voltage. The membrane potential of the cell is electrical potential across the plasma membrane. Voltage is the difference in charge between the 2 points. Potential across the sarcolemma is quite small. It's measured in millivolts, or 1/1000th of a volt. Resting membrane potential is electrical potential across the sarcolemma of resting muscle fibers, measures a negative 85 millivolts, meaning the cytosol is 85 millivolts more negative than the extracellular fluid. So the inside is more negative than the outside. Electrical changes occur across the plasma membrane at places called ion channels, and these create what is called a resting membrane potential. Ions cannot diffuse through the lipid component of the plasma membrane. They must rely on specific channels. These are referred to as ion channels. Leak channels are always open. They continuously allow ions to flow down the concentration gradient because of between excuse me, the cytosol and the ECF. Gated channels are closed at rest. They open in response to a very specific stimulus. There are ligand-gated channels, which open in response to binding of specific chemicals or ligand to a specific receptor. Voltage-gated channels open in response to changes in voltage. Mechanically gated channels open in response to mechanical stimulation such as pressure, stretch, or vibration. Hydrophobic phospholipid bilayer of any plasma membrane is impermeable to ions. Think back when we talked about semi-permeable membranes early in the semester. Sodium and potassium movement through the sarcolemma is dependent on protein channels. They will only cross by diffusion if a gradient exists across the membrane. Sodium and potassium. We talked a little bit earlier in the semester about the sodium-potassium pump. We're going to talk a great deal about it here in just a few moments. Concentration gradients maintained by the sodium-potassium pump. See, I told you. The pump moves 3 sodium ions out and 2 potassium ions into the cell per each ATP unit that is hydrolyzed. ATP hydrolysis is necessary because the pump moves ions against the concentration gradient. And when we talked about movement against the concentration gradient earlier in the semester, we call that what type of transport? We call it active transport, and active transport always requires an ATP unit to be used up or hydrolyzed. This ATP hydrolysis creates a high concentration of sodium in the extracellular fluid, while concentration in the cytosol remains lower. Creates a high concentration of potassium in the cytosol, while the concentration in the extracellular fluid remains lower. And if you'll recall, we talked about earlier in the semester, one of the reasons that sodium is so bad about causing us to retain water is when that gradient does exist and sodium ions move across the membrane by diffusion, they drag water with it. And when dragging water with it, you're increasing the amount of retained water. So there's the muscle fiber. There's a that little square there represents the part that they're showing you here blown up. Here are the little sodium potassium pump proteins. You see the 3 sodium ions that are being flushed out. Excuse me, the 2 potassium ions that are being thrown in. So 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums in through each hydrolyzed ATP. There's the ATP giving up its 3rd phosphate. And when this item then opens the other way, the 3rd phosphate releases to be grabbed back up in another part of the cell during ATP formation during the Krebs cycle of the electron transport chain. The sarcolemma has millions of pumps. They maintain a steep concentration of gradients of sodium and potassium. These gradients are critical. The driving force for passive diffusion of sodium and potassium ions through the membrane channels. Again, we do have the passive diffusion of these, but it's dependent on that gradient being there. The gradient is created by the sodium-potassium pump. This is essential in resting membrane potentials and events triggering muscle contraction. And we will talk about what happens when that gradient gets disrupted after a while. Concentration gradient is the main factor that determines movement of uncharged solutes, CO2, glucose, and oxygen across membranes. It is more complicated, for ions, also affected by electrical gradients. Diffusion of an ion across a membrane is determined by both concentration gradient and electrical gradient. That is termed the electrochemical gradient. Concentration gradient for potassium favors diffusion into the extracellular fluid. The electrical gradient of potassium, favors the movement of potassium into the cytosol. It is attracted to the negatively charged cytosol because if you think there's positive and negative. Overall, the electrochemical gradient is the sum of two forces, one drawing potassium into the cytosol, one drawing potassium into the extracellular fluid. If the forces were equal, there would be no net movement of potassium that could occur. The concentration gradient of potassium is slightly stronger than its electrical gradient. So the net electrochemical gradient is a small force that draws potassium into the extracellular fluid, helps ensure the cell doesn't lose too many potassium ions through those leak channels, which are, again, those ones that are constantly open. So here's a leak channel right here, the electrical gradient, the way that they're going to want to, the electrical gradient is going to want these things to move this way, but the concentration gradient is going to want them to move that way. And since the concentration gradient is slightly stronger, small force favors the movement of the potassium into the extracellular fluid. Sodium concentration gradient favors movement of sodium ions into the cytosol. The electrical gradient also favors the movement into the cytosol. Positively charged sodiums are attracted to its negative charges. This creates a strong electrochemical gradient that draws sodium into the cytosol. And if we want to go back, again, there's all these positives. They're going to want to go this way. So that's one of the reasons, again, for the problem with salt and our water retention is because that sodium wants to go inside the cell, where the potassium has one gradient. This gradient wants to move this way, but this gradient wants to move this way. Sodium is exactly opposite. The sodium, there's a whole lot of sodium out here, so it wants to move in here, but sodium is also positively charged, so it wants to move in there as well. There is the, So to get to a resting state, membrane potential must become more negative. Cells must lose more positive charges than it gains. The ion electrochemical gradients favor the diffusion of potassium out, sodium in. So more potassium must leave the cell than sodium enters. That occurs because potassium flows through the leak channels more easily than does sodium. And then here you go again. Here's the plasma. Electrochemical gradient favors the diffusion of the potassium. So the electric potassium wants to go this way, but sodium also wants to come this way. Potassium favored that way because of the gradient. Then just through the leak channels, potassium, because there's more potassium down here, it wants to go this way. But sodium, because there's more of it out here, wants to go this way. And these two factors cause the cytosol to lose more positive charges than it gains, leading to the negative resting potential. There we go, back to our negative 90 millivolts. Let's start with a neuron that has no membrane potential. Charges are distributed equally across the plasma membrane, so there's no potential here. If you count it, you will see equal numbers of positives and equal number of negatives on either side of the membrane. Now imagine that a positive potassium ion diffuses out of the cytosol down the concentration through a leak channel. There it goes. We now have an electrical potential. We have plus 1 millivolt up here, minus 1 charge down here. 6 positive charges are now outside the membrane, 4 positive charges on the inside. Overall charge inside the cytosol, minus 1. Extracellular fluid, plus 1. Membrane potential has been created. We now have a membrane potential. Now, imagine that happening many thousands of times as potassium ions exit through leak channels causing membrane potential to become progressively more negative. Again, there's a little video tutor in your textbook that you can look at. How do positive ions create a negative resting membrane potential? At your leisure, take a look at that video. Action potentials. These are brief changes in membrane potentials of cells from resting negative values to positive values, then back again, generated by opening and closing of gated sodium and potassium channels in the plasma membrane in response to some stimulus. The membrane experiences rapid and dramatic changes in the movement of both ions, altering membrane potential, producing an action potential. First step of an action potential is the depolarization stage. That begins when the voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium flows inward. Entry of positively charged sodium ion makes the membrane potential become less negative and less polarized, therefore depolarization. Membrane potential quickly reaches 0 millivolts and peaks at approximately 30 millivolts. Outside the cell is negative, inside the cell is positive. That's the first step of an action potential. The second step of the action potential is repolarization. Begins after the sodium channels have closed, the voltage-gated potassium channels have opened, allowing potassium to diffuse out of the cell. Loss of positively charged potassium makes the membrane potential more negative, returns the sarcolemma to its resting potential. Potassium channels then close once the cell reaches its resting membrane potential. So there is the drawing showing you, here's the cytosol, here's the sodium channel is closed, the potassium channel is closed, both are closed. Sodium channel opens, allows all of this sodium to start moving, changing the action potential between these two areas. Then this one will then close, allowing this one to open. These stop moving, these start to go out, and that is the repolarization stage. In other words, we get to an equal stage on either side. We have the resting stage, we have the depolarization stage, so here we have the action potential, and we have the repolarization stage, and we get back down to the resting stage again. Muscle fibers exhibit conductivity or electrical changes across the sarcolemma are not isolated events. Action potentials don't stay in one place. They are conducted or propagated throughout the entire sarcolemma, such as ripples. If you throw a stone into a pond and the ripples start to go out from where the stone hit out toward the edge of the pond. The process is very fast, results in the repolarization of the entire sarcolemma, including the T-tubules. The arrival of the action potential at T-tubules initiates muscle contraction. Let's stop there, let my throat rest for a moment, then I will pick up with one more video for today, I believe.